Hey friends, before we dive into this week's episode, just a heads up. Our podcast talks about suicide, sexual abuse, and other trauma, and some of what you hear may be triggering, so please listen with care. This is The Survivors, real stories, raw conversations, and the truth about what it means to keep going after the hardest things. We're so glad you're here. Let's keep surviving together. Welcome back to The Survivors. If you're joining us for the very first time, I'm Lisa. Nice to meet you. And if you've already been with us since episode 1, way back earlier this year, then you know already, if you're watching this episode, that things look a little bit different. The Survivors is raw, it's real, and we're not holding back the season. And last week, I got to introduce you to someone really special. We're starting off a whole new era of the show. And I'm going to introduce her all over again because I'm so grateful to be sharing the mic and the screen with my new co-host, Natasha J. Layton. Hi.
Hi.
How
it's a
are
pleasure
you?
to be here again.
I know, right? So today is part 1 of your story.
Yeah.
And what a story it is. And I want to say this up front. And you and I talked a lot about this offline, but I want to say it to everybody who's listening. This story is not trauma for shock. It's trauma told by Natasha, by the survivor, on her terms, in her voice, her way, because that is how she gets to reclaim her own power with so much that's been taken away from her. And she gets to take it back by sharing what she wants to share for whatever reason she chooses to share it. So Natasha, this is you. This is your story. Wherever you feel you want to start, I'll give you maybe just like a little jumping off point, and I'll ask you a question. Okay. So if your life, I was trying to think of the right way to do this, and this is what popped into my mind. If your life had a headline that summed up the weight of everything that you've experienced, what would that headline be, do you think?
Probably surviving the unimaginable, because I've heard that so many times in my life. I can't imagine surviving what you have survived.
Yeah. It's true. I know that's exactly what I thought about you when I heard about you. And I had only even heard the tiniest little bit of your story, which I thought was unimaginable in and of itself. But, you know, I want people listening to notice how heavy that sounded when you said it, that the unimaginable. This is a lifetime of trauma that you're talking about, that you're going to share with us. It's one thing on top of another and another and another. And the fact that you're even sitting here and that we're having this conversation matters so much more than I have the words to share. So I don't want to waste any time. I want to just kind of jump right in. I want to give kind of like the little pretext and just say that before we start with your story, I'm just going to kind of paint the picture real quick and let you fill in all the blanks. So you were a member, your family was a member of the FLDS, which is the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And that is a polygamy cult. We're calling it a cult because that's what it is. Before the loss of your brothers, before your own suicide attempts, let's start maybe with what life looked like inside the FLDS when you were a little kid, when you were a teenager, keeping in mind that anybody who's listening to us knows, if you know anything about the FLDS, then you know the name Warren Jeffs. And I'm going to let Natasha explain what her connection is to Warren Jeffs. But suffice it to say that he was one of the FBI's most wanted criminals when he was the prophet of the FLDS. Can you take us to that time in your life, back when you were living within that cult? What did it look like? What did it feel like? And how did it shape who you are?
Well, we grew up on a small compound at the mouth of Little Cottonwood Canyon in Sandy, Utah. And there was 4 houses that were ours and our uncle's. And then there was the big church/schoolhouse. And then my grandfather's house next to it. So I think there was a total of like 6 houses on this compound. And we had this big concrete wall that spanned the length of all these properties, blocking the main road that leads right up to a very popular ski resort. And I knew from a very young age that we were different. My mother cleaned houses for a living, and just regular people, Gentiles, as we were told to call them. And so I knew we were different because I was exposed to the outside world. I obviously going to the grocery store and things like that. And I always saw the way that they dressed, and it was so cool. And my mom actually made her first 4 children. She made all of our clothes when we were little. And we did mine and my sister's dresses. They kind of looked like the little prairie dresses that you see on the TV and things like that, but they were cute and had lace and things like that. So my mom obviously took a lot of pride in making sure we look presentable and things like that. But that's also part of the cult, is that outside appearances is very important. Like, you never let on that anything awful is going on in your home. Like, it's keeping up with the Joneses, all the things. And so I come from a home where there was 3 mothers. My dad, he was actually a Vietnam veteran. He was drafted into the military, and he actually fought over in Vietnam. And he came home on leave, and on his way home, he was told from the airport, he was told by his parents that he was getting married in 3 days. And he's like, okay, who am I marrying? And I think he had met her once, or maybe even had only seen her in passing. They'd never actually even met or had a conversation. And so he was married 3 days later, and they moved to Colorado, where he finished out his military contract. They immediately started having kids. She had 5 kids in 6 years. It was a lot.
It's a lot of kids.
Yeah. And then my mother, Sherry, is actually, so Susan and Sherry are full-blooded sisters. And it's very common in the polygamist community for sisters to end up marrying the same man. My mom fell in love with my dad, as Susan and Dad would come over every Sunday with the kids and things like that. And my mom fell in love with him, and she actually asked to be placed with him when she was 18. And my maternal grandfather did not believe in letting his daughters get married at a very young age. He said, put it out of your mind. You're not ready. He made her wait till she was 21, and then she married my dad. And right from the beginning, there was tension in the household. If that's one thing I could say that I grew up in, was like this underlying tension within our home. It was palpable.
How? What kind of things did you see?
I don't remember witnessing this, but so I'm, of the 20 children, I'm number 13.
Okay.
Smack dab in the middle. But apparently in the earlier years, the mothers particularly Mom and Susan, used to get in fist fights.
Oh, okay.
Usually it was because their kids were fighting, like, Susan's kid hurt one of Mom's kids, things like that. It was usually generally about the kids, because each mother is very protective over their children.
Sure.
And so they used to get in fistfights, and Dad would get called to, hey, the moms are fighting. I know that when the third wife was brought in, she was 16. She was actually placed with my dad because she was a troublemaker. And the best way to solve that, doesn't make any sense, marry her off and throw her into the family. There was 9 kids at that point, and she was we later found out years later, she was dealing with being sexually abused by her dad and brothers. So she just brought a whole host. And so being thrown into taking care of these kids, and all the mothers worked doing house cleaning and this, that, and the other. And then also took turns who was in charge of the kids that day. And she would beat the living shit out of all of us, particularly my oldest brother, Clayne. He was a very defiant child. We'll explain why later, but there was a story of Martha is the third wife. So there's Susan, Sherry, and Martha. And I apologize if this is very confusing. It's all very confusing to me sometimes because there's so much. So Martha was on kids one day, and she was beating the shit out of one of the kids with Lincoln logs. I don't know if you remember those Lincoln log things.
I had a very, very big set of Lincoln logs. I remember them well. Of course, now I'll never think of them the same way again, but I remember them well.
Yeah. So she was beating the shit out of one of the kids, and Clayne was standing at the top of the stairs and had the younger kids giving him spoons and utensils, and he was chucking them at her at the bottom of the stairs, trying to save his younger sibling. And it also later came out that I don't know if you've ever seen a big commercial grade metal spoon, like they're like this long.
Yeah, sure.
She was beating us with that. When my dad found out about that, I'll never forget this. He gathered us all in the kitchen and he took that spoon and bent it over his knee and I think tied it in a knot and said, if I ever find out that any of my wives are beating my children with this, there's going to be hell to pay. There was a tremendous amount of abuse that occurred, physical abuse, sexual abuse that endured at the hands of my older brother, Marcus. I was between the ages of 3 and 4. And I actually did not remember that abuse until I was about 14 and I started having flashbacks. There's had been other reports of some inappropriate things happening with other siblings, although the way I was explained, it was very minor. Amongst the sibling, mine was the worst. I know that some of my other siblings were sexually abused by my uncles, including Warren Jeffs, at the schoolhouse, which was 2 houses down. That's where we all went to school at Alta Academy. And we listened to him every morning. We started in first grade, and we all had to sit there in the big meeting room with this god awful green carpet, puke green carpet. And we had to listen to him preach. And as time went on, he stopped preaching from the Book of Mormon, which is the primary book that Mormons read from, and started preaching from his own teachings. And it was brainwashing to the fullest. I mean, absolute, utter brainwashings. And when I hear the recordings of him, because he had it recorded, all of his talks for years and years and years, an hour every morning. And when I hear those recordings, it is like a visceral reaction.
I
I
can't
have to
imagine.
not actively vomit because it is so just, ugh.
I think for context, for people who don't know about the FLDS and about your uncle, Warren Jeffs, talk for a second. I know you mentioned it briefly in episode 1, but if anyone hasn't listened to episode 1, just give people a quick refresher on what the FLDS is in terms of it being a polygamy cult. Like, explain that part of it.
Okay.
And that there is a prophet, and that Warren Jeffs was the prophet, and and that there is all of this, multiple wives, multiple homes, multiple households and children.
Okay. So Mormonism started in the mid 1800s by a man named Joseph Smith. He was, and I'm way off on my history because I've blocked it out. This was all just crammed into my brain as a kid, but he founded his own church. He believed that in order to there's 3 levels of heaven. In order to get to the highest level of heaven, you have to live polygamy and have multiple wives here on planet Earth. So he took his following and they, moved across the country. And with the second prophet, Brigham Young, they moved to Utah. Well, in the late 1800s, in order for Utah to gain statehood, the federal government said, well, you can't have polygamy. And so people that believed that in order to get to that highest level of heaven, you had to maintain have polygamous wives, they broke off and started their own church. And then that, in the mainstream Mormon church that has millions of followers, they continued on, got their statehood. So that's where the original break happened. And the men continued on, and there was always a prophet, one man that was in charge. And then there was usually very similar to the mainstream Mormon church now. There's a quorum of 12, so his advisors.
And your grandfather, Rulon Jeffs, was the prophet for a long, long time, right?
Yes, he was the self-proclaimed prophet, yes. And in the 1950s is when there's been documentaries on this and things, you can find them, where the state actually came in and arrested many of these men for having multiple wives and took their children from them. And it was all very traumatic. And so because of that, polygamy became very secretive. The men couldn't talk about having multiple wives. The wives were put into separate homes oftentimes. It was very different. And then as the years went on, my grandfather Jeffs was put in prison. I can't remember exactly. But he did split up his wives and put them in separate houses. And actually, my grandfather Rulon, he served a mission in England. He actually left polygamy and joined the mainstream Mormon church. But then I don't know what happened exactly. He decided to go back to it. So in the 70s, there was we called him Uncle Leroy as a term of endearment. You called the prophet Uncle so and so as a term of endearment and respect. And so his name was Leroy Johnson. And according to my mom, he was a good man and kind and things like that and wasn't power hungry. Well, he was getting to the end of his age. And my grandfather, Roland, was on the a council and he believed, due to his seniority and things like that, that he should be the next prophet. And other members of the were like, no, we get to vote on this. And well, those that believe grandfather was the true prophet, they left and followed him. So then there was another split. And certain members followed this group over here that didn't believe that there should be an actual prophet, but like a quorum of the 12. There wasn't going to be just one man in charge. It was going to be like a council. And my grandfather's followers, and he became the self-proclaimed prophet. Of the majority were his children. He fathered 65 children. Yeah, with
Mhm.
I think like 13 wives. My maternal grandfather has even more children than that. He was having children into his 80s.
I have some thoughts, but I'll share them with you offline.
Hello, my friend. My name is Aaron Mashpitz, and I'm the founder and owner of You Are Loved, which is a nonprofit mental health organization dedicated to spreading awareness and breaking the stigma around suicide and mental illness. We exist to offer a beacon of love to all people living with mental health conditions. The inspiration and reason behind You Are Loved is my big sister, Rachel, who died by suicide in 2018. The mission of You Are Loved is to remind us all that even in our darkest moment, you are absolutely loved and you're not alone. So to learn more, please visit youarelovedlife.com and use the discount code SURVIVOR10 for 10% off all You Are Loved merchandise. Thank you.
I am very conflicted about that, as these old men are marrying children, marrying women that are young enough to be their granddaughters and their great granddaughters. It's
Mhm.
gross.
Yeah,
It's 100% gross.
yeah.
It should not be happening. And so as grandfather came into power and started his own thing, then Warren, through his mother, became kind of like grandfather's like go-to son.
The
Obviously, he had a
chosen
number to
one.
choose from.
Mhm.
And Warren was put in charge of a new school that grandfather built, and that was 2 houses down from where I grew up on the compound. And I believe Warren was like 17 years old when he was made principal of this school, which is nuts. And that's how he gained access to all these children, that he was not only abusing his own children, but God knows how many children. So as grandfather was getting older in age and Warren was inserting himself more and more into church matters and things like that, and he basically the last 10 years that grandfather was alive, Warren was actually running the show behind the scenes. And my father was actually the first of many men that were excommunicated from the church because they posed a threat to Warren. And we were excommunicated at a time, this was my first experience with death. My oldest brother, Clayne, and several of my older siblings actually left the church and became apostates, but we still communicated with them and they still came over every Sunday. And Clayne had a baby, 2 babies with a young girl. You know, they met at 18. She was outside of the church. And his second child, her name was Cheyenne, and she died of SIDS at 6 months old. That was 1997. That was my first experience with death. And to see this tiny little baby, it just was horrific. And that was ultimately when my family was excommunicated, because we were still maintaining contact with our siblings that were left the church. And my father was called to his monthly meeting with my grandfather for tithing, and grandfather says, "I understand you've been harboring apostates in your home." And my dad said, "Well, if you mean my children, then yeah." He said, "You know, you're not supposed to do that, and you need to make a choice, your church or your children." And my dad said, "My children, of course." And so then my grandfather said, "Well, and in my opinion, you no longer hold the priesthood, and you're no longer a member of our church." Um,
And you were how old?
12. Yeah, 12. And so We stayed on the compound in our home, but we lost all of our relationships because it was very family oriented. Our uncles lived next door. Our best friends were our cousins that live right next door, and we cut off all access. We lived every day with our cousins, and all of a sudden just bam, gone. And it was really hard for us to lose all sense of community. It was really hard. So I apologize. I have a tendency to do this because as I'm telling one part of the story, then I end up in a certain area, and then I have to kind of retract because
Well,
other
but
things
that's okay. I
happen.
mean, you've got you've got a very, very complicated history. There's so many different things that make up your individual brand of trauma.
Right.
And I mean, there's sexual abuse. You've already alluded to that. There's living within a polygamy cult for most of your early childhood. We haven't even talked about the attempts you've made on your own life and the suicides of your brothers. And I mean, maybe that's a place to slide into at this point.
So the biggest impact on my life was the sexual abuse that I endured from my older brother, Marcus. And that occurred between the ages of 3 and 4, but I did not have recollection of that until I was 14 when I started having flashbacks about it. And when I had the first flashbacks, I was actually on the phone having a conversation with this boy that I had liked. And by this time, we had obviously left the church. I was 14 and I was in public school, things like that. And I started having these flashbacks, and it was the weirdest sensation because it was like having an out of body experience, but it was real and it was me. And I was looking at myself from above. It was absolutely nuts. And then I started replaying it all. And I was like, oh my God, he actually lured me up into his room to sexually abuse me and was touching me inappropriately. And I remember laying there on his bed with him and his hands just over me down here and just back and forth and back and forth. And the reason that I grappled with it with guilt for a lot of times, and I think this is very common with survivors, this is the sickest part. How could a 3 and 4-year-old have asked for that?
You didn't.
And this is the hardest part because sexual pleasure feels good, even at 3 and 4 years old.
You were a toddler, Natasha.
I was a toddler. And so when I was having these flashbacks at 14, 15 years old, and I was like, well, maybe I asked for it. Maybe I liked it. And I didn't. It took me years to realize that was not my fault. I did not ask for that. It happened multiple times. And then I was like, well, maybe it wasn't that bad because he didn't put his penis inside me. It was just his fingers. I realized later as I was in therapy and I was doing all these inappropriate things. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of play therapy, that kids that have experienced sexual trauma where they have them play with like dolls or Barbies. That's what I was doing unbeknownst to myself. I was therapizing myself. I was in therapy as a child. I was doing inappropriate things with my Barbies that I had no idea what they were doing. I didn't know what sex was, but they were doing things.
I think it's really, really important right now for anybody who's listening to clarify that not only did you bring this up to your parents, but that your brother was confronted. And I want you to be the one to tell people what happened when he was confronted.
My first attempt was I was 15 and I was in my room. I didn't want to be here anymore. I had a knife. I was running it over my wrists. I didn't want to be here anymore. I couldn't deal with it anymore.
So when you say attempt, you mean attempt on your own life?
Yes.
Yeah.
I do. And in a desperation, I called my older sister, Jenny, and I believe Jerusha, they shared a house together. They had recently gotten a house together and they both picked up the phone. This was back in the days when there was a house phone. And it just in tears telling them what I had experienced and what all these flashbacks, and they were just in complete shock. They had no idea. And they wanted me to tell mom and dad, And I said, no, I don't, because Marcus was like the perfect son. He was just never done anything wrong. He was the golden boy. And I didn't think that they would believe me. And 6 months went by before I finally got so bad that Jenny's like, "You've got to tell mom, dad." She's like, "I'll come over tomorrow after work. You're going to sit down. You're going to tell mom and dad." And I did. And they sat there kind of looking at me weird. "Well, what were you thinking?" They asked me all these weird questions. "How were you feeling? Were you scared? And they just sat there, and I'm literally sobbing, shaking, sobbing as I'm telling them these stories. And my dad said to mom, "Sherry, go comfort your daughter." And so she came and sat by me and hugged me, and that was that. My dad called Marcus the next day and asked him if it was true, and he said yes, it was true. And so dad made Marcus write me and my mom a letter. Why he needed to write my mom a letter, I have no idea. And a few weeks go by, and I get home from school, and mom says, "Your letter is there from Marcus." Okay, she got hers. I never read hers. I sat down and I read it. And, he profusely apologized, blah, blah, blah. But the one thing that stood out to me the most, and I will absolutely never forget, is he said, "We both know there was no real damage done." In his mind, he did not fully traumatize me because he didn't rape me. And then that was that.
That's an understatement.
Yeah.
Wow. I want to pause for a second.
Okay.
As much for you as for me as for people who are listening, because that's a lot. And what I want people to understand is that what you just heard Natasha share and explain, that is such a small part of your story. And the way that you shared it, just unapologetically, just letting people know exactly what it is that happened, that is the truth of this podcast. That is what we're talking about. And in your case in particular, where your story is concerned, your survival doesn't start at the end of what you just shared. But that was the beginning for you. Aside from life as a member of the FLDS, that is where so much of your trauma, am I right to assume that that's where so much of it started?
Because
And
I was left to deal with that trauma on my own.
right.
And it was
Right.
buried.
Yeah.
It was a dirty family secret. Don't ever talk about it again.
Yeah. And you didn't, not for a long time. And I think maybe this is the part of this episode where we stop where we are, because I know there is so much more to come. We have not even touched on other suicide attempts, the other suicides in your family, more about your uncle and what has happened to him in recent years. And there's so much more. There's so many more layers. So you feel comfortable if we pause here and we regroup next
Yeah,
week?
because
And
that's a lot for people to swallow.
it is a lot. It is a lot. So if today stirred something up in you, because we talked about a lot, we talked briefly about your attempts. We've talked about cult life. We've talked about escaping that. We've talked about sexual abuse and physical abuse, and that's a lot for people to take in. So if it stirred something in you, and I know it stirred something in me, there are a few things that I hope people will hold on to. First of all is that survival usually, and in your case is true, survival usually starts way before anybody else sees it. You were surviving before anybody ever even knew that you were surviving. Second thing is that naming your story in your words, in your voice, that is how we fight back against the trauma that's happened to you, or anyone for that matter. And the last thing is that you don't have to tell your whole story all at once.
Yeah.
You can do it in layers, just like you're doing with us. And that pacing and those details, that's up to you. That's completely up to you. So we're going to end here. I know we're a little longer than we usually are on our episodes, but there's just so much that we want to be able to touch on. Next week, we're going to continue with part 2 of Natasha's story, her background, what brought her here. And I just want to say this directly. If today felt really heavy, it means your body was listening. And that's okay. That's exactly what's supposed to be happening. It means you're human. There's no way you can hear a story like this and not feel it in your bones. So take care of yourself. Take care of your mental health. And we hope you'll join us right back here a week from now. And in the meantime, just keep surviving.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening. Thanks so much for listening and for being part of the survivors community. No matter where you are in your story, you're not alone, and you're definitely not broken. Healing takes time, and it looks different for everyone. The fact that you're still here and still trying means you're already doing the hard work. If something in today's conversation resonated with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it too. That's how we keep these conversations going and remind each other that there's always hope.
And if you or someone you know is struggling, please remember, help is always out there. You can call or text 988 anytime to reach a trained crisis counselor like me. And for more mental health resources, tools, treatment options, and content to support your mental health, visit thehelphub.co. We're so grateful you're part of the Survivors family, and we'll be back next week with another honest conversation about life after the hardest things. Until then, take care of yourself and your people, and keep surviving.